Hey everyone, tonight we're going to step back way back into a world where life was short, brutal, and often relentlessly unfair, especially if you happen to be born a woman. Imagine a flickering rushlight casting long shadows on rough-hewn walls, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. You hear the distant bray of a donkey, the low murmur of voices, and perhaps the unsettling quiet of a deeply rural night. This isn't a fairy tale. It's the grinding, relentless reality of medieval Europe where simply surviving each day was a triumph. You probably won't survive this without feeling a profound sense of gratitude for modern life. And honestly, that's the point. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where you're all drifting off from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a tiny, cramped hovel, the air thick with the scent of damp straw and fear. A new life is entering the world, and if you're a medieval woman, this moment, the moment of a sure birth, is arguably the most perilous of your entire existence. Forget sterile hospitals and skilled doctors. You're surrounded by other women, perhaps a village midwife, her hands rough and experienced, or simply neighbors and family members relying on generations of handed-down lore. The pain is immense, the process agonizingly slow, and the risk of death both for you and the tiny life struggling to emerge is terrifyingly high. This harrowing reality of childbirth, a leading cause of female mortality in the Middle Ages, is a mainstream historical fact that shaped countless lives. Should you survive the birth, and many didn't, your ordeal isn't over. Your newborn, especially if it's a girl, faces an immediate and daunting challenge. Survival kai. Infant mortality rates were astronomical. Imagine losing half or even more of your children before they reach adulthood. You wouldn't just be heartbroken, it would be an expected if tragic part of life's brutal cycle. Disease, malnutrition, and even simple accidents could claim a tiny life in an instant. There's no modern medicine, no vaccines, no understanding of germ theory. A simple cough could escalate into a fatal pneumonia, a minor cut into a deadly infection. You'd find yourself constantly battling against unseen forces, performing folk remedies and desperate prayers. The very concept of childhood as a protected, playful time simply didn't exist in the same way it does today. From the moment a girl could walk, she was expected to contribute to the household. She was another pair of hands, a future mother, a potential asset for the family's survival. A quirky tidbit: some medieval medical texts offered advice on how to tell if a baby would live or die based on subtle physical signs often rooted in superstition rather than science offering false hope or grim confirmation. You'd probably laugh if you heard the one about checking if a baby would survive by seeing if it would eat bread soaked in beer. Well, maybe not laugh given the circumstances, but you get the picture. Historians still argue whether the high infant mortality rates led to a different form of maternal attachment, perhaps a more guarded love to protect against inevitable loss, or if the deep human bond of parenthood transcended all hardship. From your perspective, holding that tiny fragile life, you know the love is fierce, even as fear gnaws at you. The first few days, weeks, months are a constant vigil, a desperate hope against overwhelming odds. This precarious beginning sets the stage for a life defined by hard labor, limited choices, and the ever-present shadow of mortality. You exist in a world where simply drawing your first breath is a triumph, and every subsequent breath is a privilege. Should you, a medieval girl, manage to survive the treacherous gauntlet of infancy, your childhood is less a period of carefree play and more an apprenticeship in survival. Forget toys and formal schooling as we know it. Your education begins almost as soon as you can walk. You are a small but increasingly capable set of hands, and every task, no matter how humble, contributes to the family's precarious existence. You might be 3 or 4 years old, a tiny shadow trailing your mother, learning by observation and imitation. Your playground is the muddy yard, your toys are sticks and stones, and your most important lessons are practical skills. You'd be taught to churn butter, to gather firewood, to carry water from the well in small, manageable buckets. Your fingers, though small, would learn to pluck feathers from a chicken, to knead dough, to spin wool into thread. These aren't chores in the modern sense. They are essential contributions to the household economy, crucial for keeping your family fed and clothed. There's no time for idleness, every moment counts. This early immersion in household duties and manual labor for medieval children, especially girls, is a mainstream historical fact defining their upbringing. By the age of 7 or 8, you're often considered a miniature adult capable of performing a wide range of tasks. You might be sent to tend geese collect eggs or help weed the small garden plot. Your hands might be scratched and calloused, your clothes perpetually stained with dirt and grime. You're constantly learning not from books, but from the rhythms of the seasons, the demands of the animals, and the never-ending cycle of domestic work. A quirky tidbit is how often even very young children were expected to supervise even younger siblings, acting as tiny, albeit often overwhelmed caregivers. You might even find yourself scolding a toddler for trying to eat dirt, a common enough occurrence, but with far graver consequences in a time before sanitation. Historians still argue whether the lack of a distinct childhood period, as understood today, led to a more resilient and adaptable population, or if it stunted emotional and intellectual development. You living through it experienced the constant pressure to contribute the weight of responsibility at a tender age. There are no school holidays or summer breaks. Your life is one continuous lesson in hard work and self-sufficiency. Play when it happens is spontaneous and brief, often mimicking the adult tasks you'll soon undertake fully. You might make a doll from rags or play act a harvest, but these moments are fleeting. Your childhood is defined not by innocence, but by the relentless practical or lessons one of survival, preparing you for the even harder work that lies ahead as an adult woman in the medieval world. Now imagine yourself as a peasant woman, fully grown in a medieval village. This isn't the romanticized image of idyllic rural life you might sometimes see. This is a daily grind that begins before dawn and ends long after dusk, a relentless cycle dictated by the seasons and the demands of survival. Your world is small, often confined to the village and its surrounding fields, and your life is inextricably linked to the land. You are in essence an agricultural worker, as crucial to the harvest as any man, perhaps even more so when you factor in your domestic duties. You wake to the crow of a rooster, or perhaps the insistent cries of a hungry child. Your first tasks are to rekindle the fire in the hearth, a constant battle against the cold and damp, and to prepare the meager morning meal, perhaps some coarse bread and watered-down ale. There's no running water, no electricity, no modern conveniences. Every drop of water must be hauled from the well or stream, every fire built from scratch using gathered wood and kindling. This ceaseless physical labor from dawn till dusk was the defining characteristic of a medieval peasant woman's life, a mainstream historical fact that often goes underappreciated. Your days are a blur of overlapping tasks. If it's spring, you're out in the fields sowing seeds alongside the men, your back aching from bending over the rough earth. In summer, you're weeding, scything, and helping with the first harvest. Come autumn, the backbreaking work of bringing in the main harvest dominates everything. You're also responsible for tending a small garden plot, raising chickens, perhaps a pig or two, and foraging for wild foods in the nearby woods. Back in the humble home, the work never stops: grinding grain into flour, kneading bread, spinning wool into thread, weaving fabric, mending clothes, and constantly cleaning. A quirky tidbit is that medieval peasant women often had a rudimentary understanding of herbal medicine, gathering wild plants to treat common ailments, a vital skill in a world without doctors. Historians still argue whether peasant women held more de facto power within their immediate households due to their indispensable economic contributions, or if their legal and societal subjugation rendered any such power negligible. You caught in this endless cycle, understand that survival dictates everything. There's a grim satisfaction in seeing a full granary or a well-stocked pantry, a momentary triumph over the ever-present threat of hunger. You learn to be resourceful, to make do with very little, and to find strength in community. You might even crack a tired joke with your neighbor about how your hands are so rough you could probably sand a plank of wood with them. A small moment of levity in a life that offers few. This relentless, unromanticized toil is the true essence of the medieval peasant woman's existence, a testament to her incredible endurance. Now pivot your gaze dramatically. You're no longer caked in mud and sweat, but swathed in layers of fine wool and silk. You are a noblewoman, living within the imposing stone walls of a castle or manor house. While your life is undoubtedly one of privilege, compared to the peasant woman, it is far from a life of boundless freedom. Instead, you exist within a gilded cage, your existence meticulously circumscribed by strict societal expectations, familial duty, and political maneuvering. Imagine the chill of stone walls even in summer, the faint scent of rushes on the floor, and the distant clatter of servants. Your days aren't spent toiling in fields, but they are filled with their own demanding responsibilities. You oversee a vast household, a complex enterprise that could include dozens, even hundreds of servants, retainers, and family members. You are responsible for managing supplies, organizing meals, overseeing the production of textiles, and ensuring the smooth running of the entire domestic sphere. This formidable role as manager of a large household was a primary duty of noblewomen, a mainstream historical fact often underestimated in its complexity. Your education, unlike that of a peasant girl, might include literacy, perhaps even a smattering of Latin or French. You might learn to play a musical instrument, to embroider intricate tapestries, or to manage complex accounts. But this education isn't for personal fulfillment. It's to make you a more valuable asset in the marriage market, a more capable mistress of a large estate. Your hand in marriage is a tool for political alliances, for consolidating land and power, and rarely, if ever, about personal affection. You are a pawn in a larger game, a living connection between powerful families. A quirky tidbit is how noble women often employed sumptuary laws to dictate what their household staff could wear, reinforcing strict social hierarchies even within the castle walls. You might even find yourself stifling a sigh when presented with another tedious report on the annual wool yield, wishing you could be out riding instead of poring over ledgers. Historians still argue whether the perceived power and influence of noblewomen, particularly in managing estates while their husbands were away at war, translated into genuine autonomy, or was merely an extension of their male relatives' authority. You living within these confines feel the weight of expectation. Your life is dictated by lineage and duty, your choice is severely limited from birth. You might spend hours on intricate embroidery, creating beautiful works of art, but even this is a demonstration of your refinement and suitability as a noble wife, rather than pure artistic expression. Your moments of true leisure might be rare, punctuated by formal meals, religious observance, and endless social etiquette. This isn't a life of physical brutality, perhaps, but one of mental and emotional constraint, a carefully constructed role that defines your every waking moment. Whether you were born into a mud-floored hovel or a towering stone castle, one inescapable truth defined a medieval woman's life: marriage was your destiny. For the vast majority, it wasn't a matter of love or personal choice, but a carefully orchestrated arrangement, a strategic alliance between families designed to consolidate land-forge alliances or simply ensure the continuation of a lineage. You might be a mere child, a girl of 12 or 14, when the negotiations begin your future, decided by fathers and powerful male relatives. Imagine the anxiety of knowing your entire adult life hinges on a decision made by others, often based on economic or political gain. You might meet your future husband for the first time days before the wedding, a stranger who would become your master, your partner in procreation, and the head of your household. There was little room for romantic notions, though affection might develop over years of shared life. This almost universal practice of arranged marriages across all social classes is a mainstream historical fact that profoundly shaped women's lives. For peasant women, marriage was a practical necessity for survival. It combined two sets of hands, two meager plots of land, and ensured the production of future laborers for the Lord. For noble women, the stakes were even higher. Their marriages could seal peace treaties or ignite wars, determining the fate of entire regions. Your dowry, the property or money you brought to the marriage, was a crucial part of the negotiation, directly impacting your value as a bride. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval marriage contracts would meticulously detail not just the financial aspects, but also the exact number of gowns, chests, and even pots and pans a bride would bring into the union. You'd probably stifle a groan if you saw the inventory list, realizing every stitch and every spoon was accounted for. Historians still argue whether the lack of choice in marriage led to widespread unhappiness and resentment among women, or if societal expectations and strong religious beliefs encouraged acceptance and duty over personal desire. You living through it experienced the quiet resignation, the understanding that this is simply the way the world works. Your role is to be dutiful, to produce heirs, and to manage the household. Any personal feelings were secondary to these overriding responsibilities. Divorce was virtually impossible, making the marital bond, however, it was formed a lifelong commitment. The expectation was not happiness, but stability and perpetuation of the family line. So you step into this preordained union, knowing that your entire existence from this moment forward is inextricably bound to another often unseen individual. With marriage secured, your true work begins the relentless, all-encompassing task of the household management. Whether in a humble cottage or a grand hall, the medieval home was a complex, self-sufficient ecosystem, and you as the woman of the house were its undisputed, though often uncredited CEO. There were no supermarkets, no ready-made goods. Almost everything consumed or used had to be produced, processed, or meticulously managed under your watchful eye. Imagine the sheer scale of the daily operations. You are the chief procurement officer, ensuring enough food is harvested, preserved, and stored to last through the lean winter months. You oversee the brewing of ale, a safer and more common drink than water, and the baking of bread, the staple of every meal. You are the textile manufacturer, from raw wool or flax, through spinning and weaving, to cutting and sewing clothes for every member of the family, and often for servants too. This immense, often invisible labor of women in managing the medieval household is a mainstream historical fact, fundamental to daily survival. Your days are a blur of practical decisions and physical work. You manage the garden, oversee the livestock, even in a peasant home. Chickens and a pig meant constant attention, and direct the activities of any children or servants. You are responsible for heating, collecting firewood, maintaining the hearth, and for sanitation, a constant struggle in a world without modern plumbing. You also serve as the family's primary nurse, armed with generations of herbal remedies and a prayer book. A quirky tidbit is that medieval women often had extensive knowledge of food preservation techniques, from salting and smoking to pickling and drying, essential skills that kept families from starving. You'd find yourself expertly salting fish, trying to make it last through the winter, probably grumbling to yourself about how much easier it would be if fish just stayed fresh, wouldn't you? Historians still argue whether the undeniable authority women wielded within their domestic spheres translated into broader societal respect, or if it remained confined to the home, reinforcing a separation of public and private power. From your perspective, living this life, you know your value is undeniable to your family's survival. Your efficiency, your foresight, and your ceaseless labor directly impact whether your family eats, stays warm, and remains clothed. It's a job that never truly ends, a perpetual cycle of chores and responsibilities. There's a certain grim satisfaction in seeing a well-stocked larder or neatly stacked piles of spun wool, a testament to your unceasing efforts. This is the woman's domain. A bustling, demanding world where every task, however small, contributed to the relentless effort of merely surviving. Having mastered the complexities of household management, your most terrifying and inescapable duty awaits. Childbearing. For a medieval woman, pregnancy was not a time of anticipation and joy, but one fraught with immense danger and profound uncertainty. You might endure pregnancy after pregnancy, each one a roll of the dice, a gamble with your own life, for the sake of lineage and labor. The fear is a constant companion, a dull ache beneath the surface of your daily toil, especially if you recall a neighbor's grim fate or your own close calls. Imagine the discomfort, the nausea, the sheer physical burden, all while continuing your relentless daily chores. There were no prenatal vitamins, no regular checkups, no understanding of nutrition or hygiene in a way that would genuinely protect you. Superstition often mingled with rudimentary knowledge. You might wear an amulet or recite prayers, hoping to ward off evil spirits or ensure a safe delivery, a quirky tidbit that speaks to the desperation of the times. The advice you received could range from genuinely helpful herbal remedies to utterly bizarre practices. You'd probably try everything, wouldn't you, out of sheer desperation. Then comes the labor itself. It could last for days, a grueling marathon of pain and exhaustion. You're likely confined to a small, often unsanitary room, attended by female relatives and a local midwife whose skills varied wildly. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for women in the Middle Ages, a stark and undeniable mainstream historical fact. Hemorrhage, infection, and complications from difficult births claimed countless lives. You hear stories hushed and terrifying of women who simply languished after a birth, never fully recovering, slowly fading away. You understand that each pregnancy carries a very real possibility of becoming your last. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates associated with childbearing led to a fatalistic acceptance among women, or if it fueled a deeper spiritual devotion and sense of community among those who shared this perilous common experience. From your perspective, living through it, you feel a desperate hope, a fervent prayer for survival with each contraction. The relief if both you and the child survive is immense, fleetingly eclipsing the exhaustion and pain. But that relief is always tinged with the knowledge that the cycle will likely repeat, and with it the ever-present shadow of danger. You're a vessel for life, yes, but one constantly sailing on stormy seas with little control over the tempest. Beyond the confines of the home and the fields, medieval women, particularly in towns and cities, played crucial and diverse economic roles. You weren't simply confined to domestic chores. Your labor was often vital to the family's income, extending far beyond the household and into the bustling marketplace. While men dominated certain trades, women were integral to many others, often in ways that are easily overlooked today. Imagine the sights and sounds of a medieval market. You might be there not as a shopper, but as a vendor selling eggs from your chicken's vegetables, from your garden, or the surplus ale you brewed. You might even be a pure merchant, operating a stall, haggling with customers, and managing finances. Women were frequently involved in the food and drink industries, from baking and brewing to selling fish and dairy products. Their presence was essential to the daily commerce of medieval urban centers. This widespread participation of women in various trades and crafts is a mainstream historical fact, highlighting their economic contributions. Many women were also active in guild, though often in a more limited capacity than men. While they might not always hold master status or participate in guild governance, they worked as apprentices and journeymen alongside their husbands or fathers. You might be a skilled weaver, your fingers deftly manipulating the loom, producing valuable cloth that was sold far beyond your village. Or perhaps you assist in a butcher shop preparing meat for sale, or in a metalworking shop helping with lighter tasks. A quirky tidbit is that in some specific trades like silk weaving or brewing, women actually formed their own guilds, demonstrating a degree of collective economic power and organization. You'd probably find yourself thinking that joining a women's guild was a far better prospect than endless chores, wouldn't you? Historians still argue whether women's participation in these trades afforded them greater social standing and independence, or if their economic contributions were ultimately undervalued and often seen as secondary to men's. You laboring alongside men in the marketplace feel the direct impact of your work on your family's survival and prosperity. It's a testament to the sheer adaptability and resilience of medieval women that they carved out these vital economic niches, often against significant societal barriers. Your hands, once calloused from fieldwork or domestic chores, now might be stained with dye from wool or flour from the bakery, a constant reminder of your multifaceted contribution to the bustling economy of the age. As you navigate the challenging life of a medieval woman, you inevitably confront the rudimentary, often brutal reality of medieval medicine. Forget sanitized clinics or effective treatments. Your health and that of your family is largely a matter of luck, resilience, and a potent mix of folk remedies, superstition, and occasional painful interventions. Illness and injury are constant threats, and the help available is by modern standards terrifyingly inadequate. Imagine the agonizing pain of a toothache with no dentist or the burning fever of an infection with no antibiotics. You might rely on local healers, often women themselves, who possess generations of accumulated herbal knowledge. They might prescribe poultices of specific leaves for wounds or bitter concoctions for stomach ailments, but their understanding of anatomy, hygiene, and disease transmission is virtually non-existent. A simple cut could fester into a deadly infection. A common cold could turn into fatal pneumonia. This pervasive lack of effective medical knowledge and high rates of mortality from common ailments is a mainstream historical fact that underpinned daily life. Beyond herbalism, medical practices could be truly horrifying. Bloodletting based on the theory of humors, the idea that the body's health depended on a balance of four bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, was a common treatment for almost any ailment, often doing more harm than good. You might be subjected to crude surgical procedures without anesthesia, enduring unimaginable pain. Superstition played a huge role too. You might wear charms, perform rituals, or pray fervently to saints believing that illness was a punishment for sin or the work of malevolent spirits. A quirky tidbit, some medieval texts prescribe bizarre remedies like applying dried pigeon dung to bald spots or using wolf's liver as a cure for certain eye conditions. You'd probably find yourself questioning whether the cure was worse than the disease, wouldn't you? Historians still argue whether the reliance on folk remedies and spiritual healing fostered a stronger sense of community and self-reliance, or if it simply prolonged suffering and masked a fundamental ignorance of human biology. You suffering from a chronic ache or tending a sick child understand the desperation that drives people to try anything, no matter how strange. The absence of effective pain relief, the constant threat of gangrene from a simple splinter, and the widespread belief in supernatural causes for illness created a world where good health was a fragile, fleeting gift. This constant battle against disease and the brutal realities of medical cruelty were an inescapable part of a medieval woman's existence. Now imagine a twist in the brutal tapestry of medieval life, a sudden, unexpected shift that could bring either profound despair or a surprising degree of freedom. You've lived a life defined by your husband, your family, your lord, but then perhaps through disease, accident, or war, your husband dies. You are now a one widow. This status, while often difficult, presented a unique and complex set of challenges, and for some opportunities that were virtually impossible for a married woman. The immediate reality for many peasant widows was harsh. Without your husband's labor, especially if you had young children, sheer survival became even more precarious. You might struggle to maintain the farm, pay your feudal dues, and feed your family. Poverty was a constant threat, and remarrying quickly was often a necessity, not a choice simply to ensure a stable household. You might find yourself haggling with a reluctant suitor, knowing your future hinges on finding a new provider. This economic vulnerability for many widows is a mainstream historical fact, leading to often difficult choices. However, for some women, particularly those with some property or status, widowhood could offer an astonishing degree of autonomy. A widow, unlike a married woman, was often considered a feme sole, a woman alone in legal terms. This meant she could own and manage property conduct business and even represent herself in court without a male guardian. You might find yourself for the first time in sole control of your deceased husband's shopland or even a small estate. This newfound legal independence is a quirky tidbit offering a glimpse of unexpected empowerment in a patriarchal society. You might even discover a knack for business you never knew you possessed, managing accounts and overseeing transactions with surprising shrewdness, making a small fortune, and laughing to yourself about how your late husband always said you were too delicate for such matters. Historians still argue whether the apparent freedom of some widows genuinely improved their overall status and well-being, or if it simply meant greater responsibility and vulnerability without the protection of a husband. You, having experienced the constraints of married life, might feel a strange mix of grief and exhilaration. You're alone, yes, but for the first time, many of your decisions are truly your own. You might choose to remain unmarried, fiercely guarding your independence, or you might choose a second husband who offers companionship rather than just economic necessity. Widowhood was a difficult path, undoubtedly, but it also carved out a unique space within medieval society where women could sometimes forge their own destinies, however briefly. Stepping away from the economic realities of the outside world, you now enter a realm often perceived as an escape, the convent. For many medieval women, particularly those from noble or wealthy families, entering a nunnery offered a path distinct from marriage and childbirth, a life dedicated to spiritual devotion, intellectual pursuits, and a surprising degree of autonomy. It wasn't always a choice born of fervent faith. Sometimes it was the only viable option for women who couldn't find a suitable husband, those with disabilities, or simply those seeking refuge from the brutality of the secular world. Imagine the quiet calm of the cloister, the rhythmic chanting of prayers echoing through stone corridors, the scent of beeswax and old parchment. Your days are structured by liturgy, communal prayer, and sacred study. For many nuns, particularly in wealthier abbeys, this meant access to education far beyond what most women could dream of. You might learn to read and write, to copy manuscripts, to cultivate herbs in the monastic garden, or even to manage the considerable estates that often supported the convent. This opportunity for education and spiritual dedication for women is a mainstream historical fact, providing a distinct alternative path. While life in a convent meant strict rules, celibacy, and a withdrawal from worldly affairs, it also offered a unique form of power and protection. Within the walls of the nunnery, women could rise to positions of authority, like abbess managing significant resources in communities. They were often exempt from direct male control, answering only to their ecclesiastical superiors. This unique sphere of female governance is a quirky tidbit, offering a glimpse of female leadership that was rare in broader medieval society. You might find yourself quietly relishing the peace, perhaps even a bit of the intellectual stimulation, away from the endless demands of children and husbands. You'd probably enjoy the quiet contemplation, wouldn't you, after all that talk of market haggling? Historians still argue whether convent life genuinely empowered women by offering an alternative to patriarchal structures, or if it simply channeled female ambition into a religiously sanctioned, ultimately subordinate path. You living within these hallowed walls experience a different kind of brutal life, one of self-denial and rigorous discipline, but also one free from the physical dangers of childbirth, the subservience of marriage, and the relentless grind of peasant labor. It was a sanctuary, yes, but a demanding one, where spiritual fulfillment was sought through strict adherence to an ordered life. For some, it was a profound spiritual journey. For others, simply the safest haven in a perilous world, a chance for spiritual sanctuary from the harsh realities outside. You've seen the cloistered peace of the convent, a stark contrast to the world outside its walls. Now turn your gaze to a different kind of life, one forced upon many women by desperate circumstances. Prostitution. In medieval society, this wasn't a hidden vice. It was often an open, if stigmatized, profession existing in the shadows or even within regulated districts in towns and cities. For countless women, it wasn't a choice, but a harsh reality, a last resort in the face of poverty, abandonment, or lack of any other viable means of survival. Imagine the narrow, bustling streets of a medieval town, perhaps the stench of unwashed bodies and raw sewage, mingling with the faint scent of stale ale. You might see women, often young, perhaps dressed in slightly bolder colors than respectable housewives, soliciting clients. This wasn't a life of glamour or romance. It was one marked by incredible vulnerability, exploitation, and hardship. Many women were forced into this profession by extreme hunger, by being widowed or orphaned with no support, or by being abandoned by their families. This widespread existence of prostitution as a means of survival for destitute women is a mainstream historical fact, though often downplayed. Sometimes towns would even regulate brothels, viewing them as a necessary evil to contain immorality and collect taxes. These municipal brothels, often run by a madam or supervised by town officials, offered a degree of protection, however meager, to the women working within them compared to the dangers of working independently on the streets. But even in a regulated environment, the risks were immense: violence, disease, especially syphilis, which ravaged populations, and social ostracism. A quirky tidbit: some medieval records show towns even paying for basic health care for women in their licensed brothels, not out of compassion, but to prevent the spread of disease to the male populace. You'd probably find that darkly amusing, wouldn't you? A twisted sort of civic responsibility. Historians still argue whether the regulation of prostitution offered genuine, albeit limited, safety and economic opportunity for women, or if it simply legitimized and institutionalized their exploitation. You, glimpsing this brutal reality, understand the profound desperation that drove these women. There was no social safety net, no welfare, no easy way for a woman alone to earn a living wage without a family or guild connection. Prostitution, however grim, offered immediate food and shelter, a bare minimum for survival. It was a life lived on the fringes, constantly vulnerable, a stark reminder of the unforgiving nature of medieval society and the extreme lengths to which women were pushed just to exist. Having explored the desperate lives of women forced into prostitution, you now confront an even broader and more pervasive source of medieval women's vulnerability: their minimum legal rights, or rather, their profound lack thereof. Imagine living in a society where your very identity and standing were largely subsumed by the male figures in your life. Your father, then your husband, and if widowed, often your adult sons or male relatives. For most women, legal personhood, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. Under common law and various local customs across medieval Europe, women's legal standing was few and fragile. A married woman, a feme covert, was in many respects legally invisible. Her property, whether inherited or acquired, typically became her husband's upon marriage. She could not usually make contracts, sue or be sued, or even make a will without her husband's consent. Her legal identity was covered by his. This pervasive legal subordination of married women is a mainstream historical fact, severely limiting their autonomy. You might chuckle darkly remembering the joke about a medieval wife's legal rights. She had the right to obey. It's less funny when you realize how true it was. Even as a single woman or widow, femme soul, while possessing slightly more legal autonomy, as we touched upon, her rights were still significantly curtailed compared to a man's. She might be able to own property or engage in business, but she would still often require a male guardian to act on her behalf in formal legal matters or face a system designed by and for men. Her testimony in court might be valued less, and her ability to protect her interests constantly challenged. A quirky tidbit is that in some specific urban centers or regions, customary law might grant women slightly more property rights, particularly merchant women, reflecting practical economic necessities rather than a shift in fundamental philosophy. Historians still argue whether these legal limitations were primarily designed to protect women in a dangerous society by assigning them a male protector, or if they were solely mechanisms of patriarchal control and property consolidation. You navigating this legal labyrinth feel the constant frustration, the powerlessness. To be wronged with no recourse to have your possessions seized or your voice silenced in a legal dispute simply because of your gender would be a daily grinding injustice. It was a brutal system where justice itself often depended on who spoke for you, and for women that voice was rarely their own. Your legal status was a constant, stark reminder of your subordinate place in the medieval world. You've just grappled with the severe limitations of medieval women's legal rights. Now consider what happened when those fragile rights were transgressed, or when a woman was accused of breaking the law herself. You're entering a world where crime and punishment were often incredibly harsh. And for women, the severity could be compounded by societal expectations and gendered prejudices. Justice, if it could be called that, was swift, public, and often brutal. Imagine the fear of being accused, perhaps falsely, in a system with little concept of due process as we know it. For minor offenses like petty theft or public disorder, women might face humiliating public punishments, perhaps being placed in the stocks or the pillory, subjected to the jeers and rotten vegetables of the crowd. This public shaming served as both punishment and deterrent. A woman caught stealing a loaf of bread, perhaps out of sheer desperation for her starving children, would face a consequence disproportionate to the crime. This use of public humiliation as a form of medieval punishment is a mainstream historical fact illustrating societal norms. For more serious crimes, the stakes escalated dramatically. While women were less frequently accused of violent crimes like murder, though it certainly happened, they were often disproportionately targeted for offenses related to morality, such as adultery or fornication, which could lead to severe social ostracism and legal penalties. And if accused of a capital crime, the methods of execution were gruesome. Hanging was common, but for certain offenses, even more cruel deaths like burning were sometimes meted out. A quirky tidbit: in some regions, women accused of petty theft might be subjected to a ducking stool repeatedly plunged into water, a trial by ordeal that served more as a public spectacle than a test of guilt. You'd probably think that if you survived that you deserved to keep the bread, wouldn't you? Historians still argue whether the legal system's treatment of women was primarily a reflection of deeply ingrained patriarchal beliefs, or if it was also influenced by economic and social anxieties, particularly around female independence and sexuality. You witnessing this unforgiving justice feel the chilling reality of a society where mercy was scarce and legal recourse for women was almost non-existent. The fear of accusation, the public humiliation, and the ultimate terrifying severity of the penalties underscore the perilous tightrope medieval women walked every day. Their lives were not only hard but constantly vulnerable to the rigid and often cruel hand of medieval law. You've witnessed the harshness of medieval justice, but now prepare for a particular brand of terror that haunted women with chilling intensity: witchcraft accusations. This wasn't merely a legal issue, it was a societal hysteria, a deeply ingrained fear fueled by religious zealotry, superstition, and misogyny, often leading to agonizing trials and horrific deaths. For a woman in the late medieval period, the mere whisper of suspicion could unleash a nightmare from which there was often no escape. Imagine the sudden, inexplicable illness of a child in the village, a crop failure, or the mysterious death of livestock. In a world with little scientific understanding, these misfortunes were often attributed to malevolent forces and increasingly to the dark magic of a witch, and who was most often suspected elderly women, often isolated or widowed. Women who practiced traditional healing with herbs, or simply women who were outspoken, unusual, or unpopular. Your unique eccentricities, however benign, could become evidence against you. This pervasive fear and targeting of women as witches is a mainstream historical fact, leading to devastating consequences. The accusations could escalate quickly. You might find yourself dragged before local authorities, subjected to interrogations that were less about finding truth and more about extracting a confession. Torture, though theoretically limited, was sometimes employed to force admissions, turning innocent women into confessed practitioners of dark arts. The evidence was often flimsy: a bad harvest, a quarrel with a neighbor, or even a birthmark interpreted as a witch's mark. A quirky tidbit is how often the accusers themselves were also women driven by jealousy, fear, or petty grievances, highlighting the complex social dynamics at play. You'd probably find it ironically horrifying that the very people you lived and worked alongside could turn on you so viciously, wouldn't you? Historians still argue whether the surge in witchcraft accusations in the late medieval period was primarily a tool for social control, particularly over women, or a genuine reflection of widespread belief in demonic influence and the fragility of a pre-scientific worldview. You feeling the profound fear of such an accusation, understand that reason often had no place in these proceedings. The fear was palpable, the paranoia infectious, and the outcomes devastatingly predictable. The accused faced public shaming, ostracism, and ultimately a brutal trial by ordeal or execution, often by burning, meant to cleanse the community of perceived evil. This was the ultimate terrifying manifestation of society's control over women, amid terror's grip, that could snatch a life away with a mere breath of suspicion. You've just glimpsed the terrifying shadow of witchcraft accusations. Now let's explore a path where women, despite societal constraints and brutal realities, found immense personal power and influence: religious devotion. For many medieval women, the church offered not just spiritual solace, but also a legitimate, often the only avenue for intellectual engagement, leadership, and a sense of purpose beyond marriage and domesticity. Imagine the profound comfort found in fervent prayer, in the rituals of the church, and in a personal relationship with the divine. For women of all social classes, pilgrimage, relic veneration, and daily religious observance were central to life. For peasant women, it might be the only respite from endless toil. For noble women, it could offer meaning beyond courtly intrigues. This deep and pervasive role of Christianity in medieval daily life is a mainstream historical fact shaping worldview and behavior. Beyond personal piety, some women rose to incredible prominence through their devotion. Think of abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen, who advised popes and emperors, composed music, wrote theological treatises, and managed vast estates. Or mystics like Julian of Norwich, whose profound visions and theological insights offered comfort and guidance to many. These women, through their spiritual authority, commanded respect and wielded influence that would have been unimaginable in the secular world. A quirky tidbit is how some holy women would engage in extreme forms of asceticism, like voluntarily subsisting on only the Eucharist, believing it brought them closer to God, a practice that both amazed and disturbed their contemporaries. You'd probably find yourself thinking that a bit of fasting was a small price to pay for such intellectual and spiritual freedom, wouldn't you? Historians still argue whether the church truly empowered women by valuing their spiritual contributions, or if it merely channeled their agency into roles that ultimately reinforced patriarchal structures. You, observing these lives, see the genuine power and profound impact these women had. They founded hospitals, educated the young, advised the powerful, and provided spiritual guidance to entire communities. Their lives were often challenging, filled with strict discipline and self-denial, but they were also marked by a profound sense of purpose and intellectual rigor. For many medieval women, the path of piety offered a unique and powerful means to transcend the limitations of their earthly lives, creating a legacy that echoes even today. You've seen the power found in spiritual devotion. Now let's consider how medieval women were or weren't depicted in the enduring records of their time. Art and literature. Imagine attempting to piece together the lives of countless women from the scarce, often biased glimpses offered by male-dominated chronicles, illuminated manuscripts, and epic poems. It's like looking through a dusty stained glass window, catching only fragments of a much larger, more complex reality. In medieval art, women often appear in highly stylized roles: the Virgin Mary, a saintly figure embodying purity and suffering; Eve, the temptress responsible for humanity's fall; or idealized noblewomen adorned in rich fabrics, presented as symbols of beauty or dynastic power. Peasant women, if depicted at all, were usually shown as part of a larger scene of agricultural labor, faceless and anonymous, emphasizing their economic utility rather than their individual humanity. This predominantly symbolic or idealized portrayal of women in medieval art is a mainstream historical fact, reflecting societal attitudes rather than lived realities. You might chuckle at how a knight in a tapestry is always saving a perfectly coiffed lady, never a disheveled peasant woman who just survived childbirth. Medieval literature too often presented women through a male lens. Courtly love poetry exalted the unattainable lady, placing her on a pedestal of idealized perfection, while satirical works often caricatured women as gossip shrews or seductresses. Rarely do you find a nuanced, multidimensional portrayal of a woman's inner world, her struggles, her desires, or her daily grind. Even when women authored works, such as the mystics we discussed earlier, their voices were often mediated by religious convention. A quirky tidbit: despite the prevailing norms, some medieval fabliaux short humorists, often bawdy tales, occasionally depicted cunning or assertive peasant women outwitting their husbands or lords, offering a rare if cynical glimpse of female agency. Historians still argue whether the limited and often stereotypical portrayals of women in medieval art and literature reflected a genuine lack of female influence and diversity in society, or if they simply reveal the biases and perspectives of the overwhelmingly male creators and patrons. You trying to interpret these glimpses? Feel the frustration of trying to find the real woman behind the symbolic veil. It's a challenge to extract the lived experience from the artistic convention to understand the brutal realities of daily life, when the visual and literary records so often presented a simplified, often distorted version of medieval womanhood. We are left to read between the lines, to infer from the gaps, and to understand that the silence surrounding countless lives speaks volumes about their place in history. You've tried to glimpse women through the limited lens of medieval art and literature. Now let's consider their physical appearance and the societal expectations that dictated it: fashion and beauty. Imagine a world where clothing wasn't about personal expression or comfort, but a rigid visual code that immediately communicated your social status, marital state, and often your piety. For medieval women, dress was a constant, tangible reminder of their place in the hierarchy. You wouldn't find bright, bold colors or revealing necklines on an ordinary day. For peasant women, clothing was simple, practical, and made from coarse, undyed wool or linen. You'd wear a long tunic, perhaps an apron, and always a head covering, once married, signaling your modesty and marital status. The fabric was rough against your skin, designed for durability in the fields and homes. This practical, status-driven nature of medieval clothing is a mainstream historical fact defining daily attire. You'd probably find yourself scratching at the rough wool, wouldn't you? And longing for something softer? For noblewomen, layers of fine wool, silk, and even velvet were common, often in richer dyed colors, like deep indigo, saffron, or russet if available. Their gowns were elaborate, with long trains and intricate sleeves designed to restrict movement and emphasize their elevated status, often requiring servants to help them dress. Head coverings became more elaborate, from simple veils to complex wimples and hennons entirely obscuring the hair, and often framing the face in a very specific way. Beauty ideals favored pale skin, high foreheads, and a slender, elongated silhouette, often achieved through tight lacing. A quirky tidbit is how noble women would sometimes pluck their eyebrows and hairline back to create the illusion of a higher forehead, considered a mark of beauty. Imagine the pain and effort for that just for a fashion statement. Historians still argue whether these fashion and beauty constraints were primarily a reflection of religious modesty and social order, or if they also served as a means of controlling female bodies and restricting their mobility and agency. You wearing these layers, whether rough, homespun, or elaborate silk, feel the physical limitations. The heavy fabrics, the restrictive lacing, the constant need to cover your head, all serve as constant reminders of the societal gaze upon you. There's no freedom in this attire, only adherence to a predefined role. Even a simple trip to the market would involve a careful consideration of your head covering. Your clothes were not just what you wore. They were who you were, a visible manifestation of your brutal place in medieval society. You felt the constraints of medieval fashion. Now turn your attention to perhaps the most fundamental and constant anxiety of medieval life, particularly for women who managed the household, the relentless worry over harimar, food and famine. This wasn't about choosing what to eat, it was about having anything to eat. Your very existence revolved around the availability of sustenance, and the threat of scarcity or outright starvation was a shadow that never truly lifted. Imagine the daily grind of trying to feed a family when every meal, every morsel was hard-won. For peasant women, your diet would be overwhelmingly grain-based: coarse bread pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, and perhaps some ale. Meat was a rare luxury consumed only on feast days or when a hunt was successful. You would spend countless hours grinding grain, kneading dough, and preparing simple, repetitive meals, always aware of the dwindling stores. This monotonous, largely grain-based diet is a mainstream historical fact, defining the nutrition of the majority. The fear wasn't just about hunger, it was about outright one famine. A bad harvest due to too much rain, too little sun, or a blight could decimate crops, leading to widespread starvation. You would witness your neighbors growing gaunt, their children's bellies distended, their strength fading. In desperate times, people would resort to eating whatever they could find: roots, bark, even dirt, often leading to disease and further weakening. A quirky tidbit is how often medieval cookbooks, usually for noble households, would feature elaborate recipes for disguising simple ingredients or creating impressive but nutritionally questionable dishes, a stark contrast to the peasant's struggle. You'd probably look at a noble's feast and laugh hollowly, wouldn't you? Knowing your family was scraping by on gruel. Historians still argue whether the consistent threat of famine led to a stronger sense of community and mutual aid in villages, or if it exacerbated existing social inequalities and led to increased banditry and desperation. You living through these cycles feel the profound anxiety. Every seed planted, every animal tended, every loaf of bread baked was a small victory against the ever-present specter of starvation. The emotional toll of constantly worrying about where the next meal would come from and witnessing the suffering of others during lean times was immense. This ceaseless battle against hunger and the memory of its devastating consequences was a defining and brutal aspect of a medieval woman's daily life. You've just felt the gnawing anxiety of medieval food scarcity. Now shift your focus to another profound limitation on a medieval woman's life: travel. For the vast majority, the world was incredibly small, often confined to their village, the nearest market town, or perhaps a lord's manor. The idea of long-distance journeys for pleasure or exploration was almost entirely alien. When you did venture beyond your immediate vicinity, you faced significant dangers and an experience that was rarely, if ever, comfortable. Imagine walking for miles, sometimes days, just to reach a nearby town or a relative's house. Roads were often little more than muddy tracks infested with bandits, or simply impassable due to weather. If you were lucky, you might ride on a slow, jolting ox cart. Horses were expensive and typically reserved for men, especially knights or wealthier merchants. Journeys were exhausting, exposed to the elements, and always carried the risk of accident, illness, or robbery. This pervasive difficulty and danger of medieval travel for the common person is a mainstream historical fact, severely limiting mobility. Even for noble women, while they might ride in litters or on palfreys, Their travel was often dictated by marriage alliances, political visits, or religious pilgrimages, not personal desire. These journeys were still arduous, slow, and far from luxurious. The accommodation along the way was rudimentary at best, and the threat of ambush or illness was ever present. You would pack everything you needed, knowing that supplies were scarce on the road. A quirky tidbit is how some medieval travelers would carry a small amount of blessed earth or water from their home church, believing it would offer protection from the perils of the road. You'd probably find yourself clutching such a charm, wouldn't you? Hoping it actually worked against a band of hungry brigands? Historians still argue whether the limited mobility of medieval women contributed to stronger, more insular, local communities, or if it further reinforced their subordinate status by confining them geographically. You experiencing this rarity or in peril understand the profound isolation that defined many women's lives. News traveled slowly, information was scarce, and your worldview was largely shaped by your immediate surroundings. The idea of seeing a distant city or experiencing a different culture was a dream rarely, if ever, realized. Your world was brutal, yes, but it was also profoundly small, a constant reminder of the physical boundaries that shaped your existence. You've just realized how confined your world was by the limitations of medieval travel. Now consider a force that could violently shatter even that small familiar world: warfare. While medieval battles might conjure images of knights clashing on open fields for women, the impact of war was far more insidious, devastating, and often brutally direct, even if you never saw a single armored soldier. You are witnessing the one indirect toll, a grim reality often forgotten in the grand narratives of kings and conquests. Imagine your village, normally quiet and predictable, suddenly thrown into chaos by the approach of an army, whether your own or an enemy's. Soldiers needed to be fed often by requisitioning or simply taking your family's meager food stores. They needed shelter, sometimes forcibly occupying your home, disrupting your life entirely. Your crops could be trampled, your livestock slaughtered or stolen, leaving your family destitute. You might be forced to flee, abandoning your home and all your possessions, becoming a refugee with nowhere safe to go. This widespread suffering of civilian populations, especially women during medieval conflicts, is a mainstream historical fact illustrating war's true cost. Beyond the immediate disruption, there was the constant threat of violence. Women were particularly vulnerable to rape, abduction, and murder during periods of warfare, regardless of which side the soldiers were on. The breakdown of law and order meant that even small bands of marauders could terrorize a region with impunity. You might hide in the woods with your children, listening to the sounds of destruction in your village, praying for safety. A quirky tidbit is how often women in besieged towns played active roles in defense, throwing rocks, pouring hot water, or even aiming crossbows from walls, demonstrating unexpected courage in dire circumstances. You'd probably find yourself wishing for a bit more of that direct action, wouldn't you, rather than the terrifying helplessness? Historians still argue whether medieval warfare, despite its apparent focus on male combatants, disproportionately impacted women and children by targeting their means of survival and personal safety. You living through such times would unequivocally say yes. The trauma of displacement, the loss of family members, the destruction of your livelihood. These were the brutal realities of war for women, experiences that left indelible scars long after the knights had ridden away. The impact of warfare on medieval women was rarely celebrated in song or story, yet it was a profound and brutal force that shaped countless lives, leaving a legacy of hidden suffering and quiet resilience. You've just endured the devastating indirect toll of warfare. Now let's explore a fundamental divide in the medieval experience. For women, the stark differences between urban versus rural lives. While all medieval women faced brutality, the specific challenges and opportunities varied significantly depending on whether you lived within the bustling walls of a town or city or in the isolated agrarian rhythms of the countryside. Imagine the constant clamor of a medieval town, the shouts of merchants, the clatter of carts, the ringing of church bells, the mingling smells of markets and crowded streets. If you were an urban woman, your life revolved around trade, crafts, and commerce. You might be involved in your husband's guild, selling wares in a shop, or even running your own small business as a brewer, baker, or seamstress. Access to a wider variety of goods, services, and religious institutions was greater. Your social interactions would be more frequent and diverse, but also more anonymous. This clear distinction between urban and rural female livelihoods is a mainstream historical fact shaping daily existence. Contrast this with the rural life you've already deeply experienced: the cyclical demands of agriculture, the vast open spaces, the deep connection to the land, and the rhythms of nature. In the countryside, your life was largely defined by farming, animal husbandry, and household self-sufficiency. Your community was smaller, often everyone knew everyone else, but help could be harder to come by if an emergency struck. Access to goods and specialized services was limited, and daily life was often more physically demanding, requiring heavy labor in the fields. A quirky tidbit: while urban women might have more access to legal recourse, rural women often relied on customary law and community pressure to resolve disputes, sometimes granting them a different kind of influence. Historians still argue whether urban women, despite facing issues of overcrowding and sanitation, enjoyed greater de facto independence due to their involvement in commerce, or if rural women, with their vital role in food production, held a more fundamental, albeit less recognized, importance. You, having experienced both ends of the spectrum, see the trade-offs. The urban woman might face different kinds of exploitation in the marketplace, while the rural woman might be more vulnerable to the whims of her lord or the vagaries of the weather. The brutal realities persisted, but their precise manifestations shifted. Whether you were inhaling the smoke of a city hearth or the dust of a country field, your daily grind was relentless, shaped by the unique demands of your environment, yet equally demanding and often unforgiving. You've explored the distinct textures of urban and rural medieval life. Now brace yourself for a cataclysmic event that swept across both indiscriminately, bringing terror and death, but also in a strange, terrible way, leveling the playing field for women and men alike. The Black Death. This wasn't merely a plague. It was a demographic catastrophe, a swift and brutal reordering of medieval society that left few untouched. Imagine the sudden, horrifying onset: a neighbor seemingly healthy, struck down by painful swellings, high fever, and often death within days. The disease, carried by fleas on rats, spread with terrifying speed, sweeping through towns and countryside with merciless efficiency. You would witness entire families, decimated villages emptied, and the very fabric of society unraveling. The sheer scale of the mortality, wiping out an estimated 30 to 50% of Europe's population in just a few years, is a mainstream historical fact that utterly reshaped the continent. You'd probably find yourself thinking that you've survived childbirth and famine, only for this invisible, horrifying enemy to arrive. The initial impact was pure, unadulterated. The traditional rituals of burial broke down as bodies piled up, and the living were too few or too fearful to properly mourn or enter the dead. The air would be thick with the stench of disease and despair. But in the grim aftermath, a peculiar social and economic shift began. With such a drastic reduction in population, labor became incredibly scarce. For the survivors, this meant a sudden, unprecedented increase in their value and bargaining power. A quirky tidbit is how some women after the plague were able to demand higher wages for their work in fields or as domestic servants, or even take on trades previously dominated by men. You'd find a grim satisfaction in that, wouldn't you? A tiny silver lining in the face of such overwhelming loss. Historians still argue whether the Black Death ultimately improved women's long-term economic and social standing by creating new opportunities, or if any gains were temporary and quickly eroded by returning patriarchal norms and subsequent economic downturns. You, surviving the initial onslaught, would feel the profound shift. The familiar social order fractured, allowing for unexpected mobility. Land became more available, feudal obligations sometimes loosened, and the desperate need for labor meant that a woman's hands were suddenly worth more than they had been in generations. It was a terrifying ordeal, undoubtedly, but it also forced a brutal reevaluation of human worth, momentarily granting women a power they had rarely known before. This equalizing horror of the plague left an indelible mark, demonstrating how even in the face of ultimate destruction, seeds of change could be sown. You've just navigated the terrifying and transformative landscape left by the Black Death. Now let's consider how, in moments of extreme social and political upheaval, Women sometimes stepped beyond their traditional roles, participating sometimes reluctantly in popular rebellions and uprisings. These weren't typically about women's rights as we understand them today, but about basic survival, economic injustice, and the desire for fundamental change. Imagine the simmering discontent of a village pushed to its breaking point by oppressive lords crippling taxes or food shortages. While men often led the charge, women were rarely passive observers. You might find yourself among a crowd drawn by desperation or a fierce loyalty to your community, participating in a riot against unfair tax collectors, or marching on a manor house to protest harsh feudal dues. Women often played crucial logistical roles, gathering supplies, tending to the injured, or spreading news and rallying support. This active, though often understated participation of women in medieval peasant revolts is a mainstream historical fact, showing their role beyond the domestic sphere. Sometimes women's involvement was more direct and confrontational. You might witness women throwing stones, wielding agricultural tools, or verbally haranguing officials, demonstrating a ferocity born of desperation. Their presence could even be strategic. Authorities might be more reluctant to use extreme violence against a crowd that included women and children, although this was by no means guaranteed. A quirky tidbit: during the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, women were documented participating in the destruction of property and even in the murder of unpopular officials, acting with a ferocity that belied their typical societal constraints. You'd probably find yourself thinking that you'd finally found a practical use for all that pent-up frustration from endless chores, wouldn't you? Historians still argue whether women's participation in these rebellions was a conscious act of defiance against their patriarchal society, or simply an extension of their family's struggle for survival and a pragmatic response to immediate threats. You caught in the midst of such an uprising would feel the raw emotions, the anger, the fear, and the desperate hope for a better future. These were not calculated political movements, but eruptions of communal rage and suffering. And in those moments of chaos and struggle, medieval women, usually silenced and subservient, found a temporary, fierce voice, demonstrating their indomitable spirit in the face of overwhelming injustice. Their role was rarely central to the chroniclers, but undeniably vital to the unfolding drama of social change. You've seen women rise in rebellion, a testament to their hidden strength. Now let's consider another vital aspect of life that was often brutally limited for medieval women: education. Forget universal schooling or easy access to books. For the vast majority of girls and women, formal learning was a privilege rarely afforded. Yet glimpses of it existed beyond the elite, often in surprising forms. Imagine a young girl in a peasant household. Her classroom is the family cottage in the fields. Her lessons are practical skills: spinning, weaving, cooking, gardening, tending animals, and basic childcare. Literacy was an unnecessary luxury for her future as a wife and mother in an agrarian society. Her knowledge was passed down orally through observation and direct participation. This widespread illiteracy among the peasantry, particularly women, is a mainstream historical fact defining their intellectual landscape. You wouldn't find a grammar lesson happening during harvest season, would you? However, for some women, usually those in urban centers or associated with religious institutions, limited opportunities for literacy and schooling did exist. Daughters of merchants or artisans might learn basic numeracy to help with family businesses or gain rudimentary reading skills to follow prayer books. Within convents, as we touched on earlier, education flourished, with nuns often becoming highly literate, copying manuscripts, and even writing their own theological texts. A quirky tidbit is how some wealthy noblewomen, though not formally educated in schools, would employ private tutors or learn chaplains within their households, allowing them to gain impressive knowledge in subjects like history, literature, and even politics. Imagine having a private tutor for life skills instead of just the endless chores. Historians still argue whether the limited access to formal education for women primarily reflected societal views on their intellectual capacity, or if it was a pragmatic choice based on their expected domestic and physical labor roles. You, observing these varying levels of education, understand that knowledge was power, and for most women that power was largely withheld. Those who could read and write stood out, possessing a rare and valuable skill. This educational disparity meant that many women lived lives rich in practical wisdom and experience, but profoundly cut off from the written world, from scholarly discourse, and from a full understanding of the broader world beyond their immediate sphere. It was a silent brutality limiting intellectual growth and perpetuating cycles of dependence. You've considered the brutal limits on medieval women's education. Now let's delve into another complex area that profoundly impacted their lives: inheritance and property rules. Imagine a legal system where almost universally men were prioritized and a woman's right to own, control, or inherit property was meticulously and often unfairly circumscribed. This meant that wealth, land, and power flowed predominantly through male lines. For the vast majority of women, particularly peasant women, formal inheritance was minimal. Land, the most valuable asset, typically passed directly from father to son, or if no sons, to male relatives. A daughter might receive a dowry upon marriage, a sum of money, goods, or perhaps a small parcel of land. But this was usually transferred to her husband's control. You could work the land, contribute tirelessly to its produce, but the land itself would rarely be truly yours. This patriarchal system of property transmission is a mainstream historical fact, fundamental to medieval societal structure. You'd probably find it infuriating, wouldn't you, to put so much labor into something you couldn't truly call your own? Even for noble women, while they might inherit titles or extensive estates in the absence of male heirs, their control was often temporary or managed by male guardians, particularly during minority or widowhood. The expectation was that the property would eventually pass to a male heir, often through marriage. Elaborate legal mechanisms were in place to ensure that family wealth remained within the male lineage, reflecting deep-seated anxieties about female control over property. A quirky tidbit: some medieval legal customs, particularly in regions with strong Germanic influences, actually granted women more robust dower rights, a widow's right to a portion of her deceased husband's property, for her support, offering a small but significant exception to the general rule. Historians still argue whether these complex and often unfair laws were primarily designed to ensure social stability and prevent the fragmentation of estates, or if they were simply a reflection of an inherently misogynistic legal framework. You navigating these intricate rules feel the profound disadvantage. Your economic security, your very future, was often tied to the whims of male relatives or the unpredictable absence of male heirs. To be a woman meant constantly confronting a legal reality where your efforts, your labor, and even your bloodline often served to enrich or maintain the power of others, while your own claims to property remained tenuous at best. This systemic disadvantage in property rights was a quiet, insidious form of brutalization, shaping opportunities and enforcing dependence. You've contended with the brutal realities of property laws. Now let's delve into a less tangible, yet equally profound area of a medieval woman's brutal life: her modern, emotional world. Imagine a society where expressions of personal desire, individual ambition, or even profound sorrow were often suppressed, deemed inappropriate, or simply had no recognized outlet. The pressures of duty, family, and survival often trumped individual feelings, forcing women to carry suppressed desires and burdens in silence. Consider the arranged marriages we've discussed. While affection might grow, the initial lack of choice meant suppressing any longing for a love match. You might feel a profound loneliness, a quiet ache for a connection that society simply didn't prioritize. Motherhood, while a source of deep love, was also fraught with constant fear of loss and the relentless physical demands of childbearing. Public displays of grief, while sometimes permitted, had their limits, and you were expected to quickly resume your duties. This societal expectation of emotional restraint, particularly for women, is a mainstream historical fact shaping personal expression. You might even find yourself stifling a sigh or a quiet tear because there was simply no room for it in your day. The church, while offering spiritual solace, also imposed strict moral codes, particularly around female sexuality. Any desire outside of marriage or even simple expressions of sensuality could be deemed sinful, leading to immense guilt and internal conflict. Women were constantly reminded of Eve's fall, burdened with the collective weight of perceived female weakness. This internal policing of desires, a pervasive element of religious teaching, created a deep, often unacknowledged emotional burden. A quirky tidbit is how some medieval mystics, through their writings and visions, often expressed incredibly passionate, almost erotic love for God, perhaps channeling their earthly desires into a spiritually acceptable outlet. You'd probably think, wouldn't you, that if anyone needed an escape valve for their emotions, it was medieval women? Historians still argue whether the apparent lack of overt emotional expression in historical records indicates a genuine suppression of feelings among medieval women, or if it merely reflects the biases of chroniclers and the societal norms against public display. You glimpsing these internal lives feel the profound weight of unspoken burdens. The resilience of medieval women wasn't just physical, it was an emotional fortitude, a quiet strength forged in the constant act of carrying their true feelings beneath a facade of duty and piety. Their desires, ambitions, and sorrows, though rarely recorded, were undoubtedly real, making their quiet endurance all the more remarkable. This realm of private, emotional burdens adds another layer to the quiet brutality of their existence. You've just peered into the suppressed emotional world of medieval women. Now let's consider how their reality has often been shaped and sometimes distorted by the stories told about them. You're examining the blend of legends and reality, distinguishing between the romanticized tales spun in later centuries and the often brutal truth of their daily lives. Imagine the popular image: the fair maiden rescued by a valiant knight, the wise queen ruling justly, or the pious saint performing miracles. These are the wandery legends, pervasive in folklore, chivalric romances, and even modern media. They offer simplified, often idealized narratives where women are beautiful, virtuous, or magical, existing primarily as foils or rewards for male heroes. They provide comfort, inspiration, and escape, but they rarely reflect the messy, difficult, and dangerous realities we've explored. This prevalent romanticized portrayal of medieval women is a mainstream historical fact shaping popular perception. You'd probably find yourself thinking that if a knight rode up, he'd be more likely to demand taxes than offer a rescue, wouldn't you? The reality, as you've intimately experienced it, was far different. It was a life dominated by relentless physical labor, the constant threat of famine and disease, the terrifying ordeal of childbirth, and profound legal and social subordination. Women were not merely passive objects of male desire or heroic quests. They were active, struggling, indispensable members of society, working tirelessly to ensure their own and their family's survival. They faced real violence, real injustice, and real loss, far removed from the sanitized narratives of courtly love or valiant deeds. A quirky tidbit is how often medieval women in real life, especially peasants, were recorded in legal documents as having committed petty crimes or engaging in disputes, a glimpse into their very human imperfections and struggles, rather than idealized virtue. Historians still argue whether the romanticized legends about medieval women served a crucial psychological function, providing escapism and upholding societal ideals, or if they actively harmed women by setting unrealistic expectations and obscuring their actual contributions and suffering. You, having walked in their brutal shoes, understand the stark contrast. The gap between the fair maiden and the woman grinding grain with blistered hands is immense. The legends smooth over the dirt, the pain, the fear, and the sheer relentless grind of existence. They tell us what people wished medieval life was like, rather than what it truly was. It's crucial to acknowledge both the allure of the myth and the stark truth of the reality to truly appreciate the formidable strength and endurance of medieval women. You've peeled back the layers of legend to confront the harsh realities. Now, as our journey through the brutal lives of medieval women approaches its quiet close, let's acknowledge the vast silent majority, the forgotten voices, and the enduring strength of countless unrecorded lives. History, especially medieval history, tends to focus on the powerful, the literate, the male. The daily grind, the quiet struggles, and the profound resilience of the ordinary woman often remain invisible to modern eyes, a vast ocean of experience from which only a few drops are preserved. Imagine the millions of women whose names we will never know. The peasant women who toiled in fields from dawn till dusk, whose hands spun countless miles of thread, who buried half their children, and who simply kept going day after relentless day. The townswomen who ran businesses, cared for the sick, and managed households with quiet efficiency. The countless mothers, daughters, wives, and widows who bore the brunt of famine, plague, and war, picking up the pieces and rebuilding shattered lives. Their stories are not in chronicles or illuminated manuscripts. They are written in the very fabric of the landscape, in the enduring existence of villages, and in the continuation of humanity itself. This pervasive anonymity of most medieval women is a mainstream historical fact, highlighting the bias of historical records. You'd probably find it exasperating, wouldn't you, that so much effort left so little trace? Their strength wasn't the heroic battlefield kind. It was a quieter, more profound resilience. It was the strength to endure unimaginable pain in childbirth, to nurse children through deadly fevers, to keep a household running on meager resources, and to face down despair with pragmatic determination. It was the ability to adapt to innovate within severe constraints and to find joy and meaning in small moments amidst overwhelming hardship. A quirky tidbit: despite the lack of formal records, archaeological evidence like worn cooking tools or specific grave goods sometimes offers tantalizing if silent clues about the daily lives and even personal adornments of these otherwise anonymous women, allowing us to glimpse their existence through the dust of centuries. Historians still argue whether the challenge of recovering these forgotten voices makes it impossible to ever truly understand the full spectrum of medieval women's experiences, or if careful interpretation of existing sources and archaeological findings can offer meaningful insights. You reflecting on this feel the weight of their unrecorded lives. They were not merely statistics or nameless figures. They were individuals with hopes, fears, desires, and an incredible capacity for endurance. Their legacy isn't in grand monuments, but in the simple fact that humanity survived and progressed through an era of immense brutality carried forward on the strong, unyielding shoulders of these women. Their quiet, persistent strength is the ultimate enduring testament to their brutal lives. You've traveled through centuries, experienced the harsh realities of birth labor, legal constraints, and the immense unrecorded strength of medieval women. Now, as our shared journey finally draws to its close, allow the images of that brutal past to soften, to fade gently into the background, and prepare for sleep's final, gentle release. Let the quiet descend, the flickering rushlight of the medieval hovel, the cold stone walls of the castle, the endless dust of the peasant fields. They all recede, becoming distant whispers. The anxieties over famine, the terror of illness, the weight of suppressed desires, those burdens are no longer yours to carry. Release them. Feel the tension draining from your body, flowing away like water from a well, leaving you light and unburdened. There is no more grinding labor, no more looming threat of war or plague, no more desperate struggle for survival. The voices of those forgotten women, their enduring strength and their quiet resilience, now transform from a call to awareness into a soothing hum, a comforting presence that gently guides you. Imagine their peace earned through unimaginable hardship now extending to you. Feel your breath deepen, each exhale a further surrender to the growing stillness. The echoes of their lives, once sharp with the truth of their brutality, now blur into a soft, calming murmur, a historical lullaby designed to ease your mind. There is only the quiet, the warmth, the profound sense of safety. Let the story settle, knowing that you have honored their lives by witnessing their truth. Drift now fully, completely into the quiet, dark embrace of restorative sleep. Rest well. Sweet dreams.